In this presentation, I will be talking about value assumptions. Value assumptions is when the author takes a position on social controversy. They typically prefer one value over another value, and this is what we talked about earlier in the first slide. This is value priorities. For ethical and prescriptive arguments, an individual's value influences the reasons and conclusions that an author would make. Now, the author's unstated or hidden statement this is the author's unstated or hidden statement that critical readers must identify. The value assumption is also the link between the reason and the conclusion to determine the strength of the argument. So I'm going to explain a little bit more about the relationship between the reason and the conclusion and the value assumption. Remember, the key word here is assumption. Whenever you have an assumption, the word assumption comes from the word assume. It's not directly stated, so a lot of times you are assuming, you are making an assumption about something else. So in this situation, value assumption is basically trying to assume the values of the author. And a lot of times these values are unstated or they are hidden. So you have to be a detective to try to figure out what these value assumptions are. And these value assumptions will impact the conclusion and the type of reasons that the author uses. So a lot of times when we talk about value assumption and the relationship between the reason and the conclusion, I like to look at the value assumption as the missing add-in, okay? The reason plus what is the value assumption that equals the conclusion. And so a lot of times the author, when they give us an argument, they give us the reasons and they tell us the conclusion. But the value assumption is not stated. And so our job as critical readers is to try to figure out what values does the author have, or is the author implying to come up with the reason that they came up with, and therefore having the conclusion that they concluded with. And so the whole objective here is trying to figure out the value assumption. And in the first slide, the presentation that I did, we talked about value conflicts and value preferences. And so it's important that you know the value conflicts, you understand value conflicts and value preference to find the value assumption. And so value assumptions always impact the conclusion. So let's look at an example of how we look for the value assumption in a scenario. So our example says, this comes straight from the book, okay? The example says we should not legalize recreational drugs. Such drugs cause too much street violence and other crimes. So the author's reason is that legalization will cause more violence and crime, okay? It's the second sentence here. Such drugs cause too much street violence and other crimes. So because of this reason, the author's conclusion is that recreational drugs should not be legalized. So the question we're asking here is, what is the value assumption? What is a value that the author find that is important, that the author's not telling us, but is driving the author to use this reason to come up with this conclusion? So to find the value assumption, we first want to identify the value conflict. What values are in conflict with each other here, okay? And so with our thought process here, I see that the author is saying that we should not legalize recreational drugs. Drugs cause too much street violence and other crimes. So here we see that the value conflict is public safety versus individual responsibility. Because if we were to legalize recreational drugs, then we would rely on the individuals to make responsible choices, okay? However, to not legalize recreational drugs is to have a little bit more control of the situation. And so to have more control, the focus here is public safety because, again, it causes too much street violence. Now, keep in mind that value conflicts, you can always have more than one value conflict for a situation or scenario. In this case, I came up with public safety versus individual responsibility. Now, I want you to see what's going to happen, what happens if the value assumption is a little different and how my reasons, my conclusion changes, okay? So let's look at this next example here. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back here. Before I'm going to jump back, I was one slide ahead of myself. So we didn't identify what the value assumption is. So what is the value assumption in here in this situation? The value assumption is public safety is more important than individual responsibility. And so here we see that we have our value conflict, and our value assumption is basically stating directly what is the value preference, which is, in this case here, public safety is more important than individual responsibility. And because public safety is more important than individual responsibility, my conclusion is that recreational drugs should not be legalized, okay? All right, so now let's look at what happens when my conclusion changes a little bit. Earlier in the previous slide, I said recreational drugs should not be limited. In this situation, in this conclusion here, this one says recreational drugs should be limited to specific individuals. I'm sorry, the previous slide said recreational drugs should not be legalized. In this situation here, it says recreational drugs should be limited to specific individuals. So the question here is, what is the value assumption? Based on the reason and the conclusion, what is it that the author values? Well, we can say that the author values individual responsibility. So the value assumption is individual responsibility is more important than public safety. So here, in this very same scenario, when the value assumption changes, it also changes the conclusion. So a lot of times you're going to need to look at the reason and the conclusion to help you figure out the value assumption. Now, let's go ahead and do a couple of practices together, and I'm going to walk you through the thought process of how you're going to come up with the value assumption, okay? Keep in mind, you need to understand value conflicts and value preference in order to come up with the value assumption. So in this scenario, I have been given a conclusion and reasons for the conclusion, and I'm going to use the conclusion, the reason, to help me come up with the value assumption. So the conclusion is the workplace should offer competitive wages. The only basis for salary increase is productivity. Therefore, this type of workplace creates optimal incentives. So here's some guiding questions I'm going to use to help me come up with the value conflict and the value preference so that I know what the value assumption is. So what do we know already? One thing we know is that in the conclusion and the reason, we know that the reason is showing us that productivity means salary increase. So if they're being productive, they're going to be given a salary increase. If they work hard, they're also going to get an incentive. Now, what is valued based on the reason? So based on the reason, just the reason, the value I can see here is that is important is work ethics, positive reinforcements, and rewards. These are different types of values that I am inferring based on what the reason says. Now, what is the value? What is valued based on the conclusion? Well, the conclusion says the workplace should offer competitive wages. So a lot of times when a company tells you that they offer competitive wages, they're doing that for a reason. Companies offer competitive wages so they can have the best people apply for the job. And so usually when companies pay more, then you have a wide variety of people that will apply for the job, meaning that you're going to have better people and more qualified people. So what is something that they value based on just this sentence here in the conclusion? They value high quality people. So now I have to do the really difficult task of trying to figure out what is a possible value conflict for this scenario. So I'm going to say that this has to do with collectivism versus individualism. Okay, now again, you may not come up with the same value conflict as me, okay, and that's okay because you'll get a chance to explain why you chose these two value conflicts. So you can if you can explain that and it makes sense and it's logical, then you are correct also. So in this situation here, I say the value conflict is collectivism versus individualism. And so what is the value assumption for this argument? Is they're saying that individualism is more important than collectivism. Now, what's my explanation for my values that I selected and my value assumption? Well, what I'm trying to say here is that in this scenario, the workplace values individualism because they focus on how they want to motivate these workers by having them compete with each other, and therefore the workers become focused on their own performance. This is all about the individuals. This has nothing to do with collectivism, and collectivism usually means it's a whole entire group. So that is how I find the value assumption. Is I sort of walk myself through these questions, I find the value conflict, and then I make a direct statement to show what my value assumption is, and I explain why I chose individualism and collectivism and why I came up with my value assumption. Let's try another one. So the conclusion is the workplace should offer a team environment. And the reason? Well, if the staff respects each other, they create an environment that can be healthy and effectively productive. So let's look at some of my guiding questions. Well, what do we know? Well, we know based on what the text says that respect means a healthy environment and they are effectively productive. Well, what is value based on the reason? Well, they talk about respect and they talk about healthy environment and they talk about effectively productive. So some of the values that I came up with is the morale and a positive ethos. And that basically just means that, it's the climate, the work climate and environment is positive and the morale is also positive. Okay, so those are the values that we can infer based just on the reason. Well, what is the value based on the conclusion? Well, they talk about how the workplace should offer a team environment. So when I think about team, I think of the value cooperation. Okay, so now what is the possible value conflict for this scenario? Well, it's the same one that I chose before, collectivism versus individualism. And so here, my value assumption is that collectivism is more important than individualism because they are emphasizing the need for collectivism or teamwork. So my explanation, This workplace values collectivism because it focuses on teamwork, such as the morale and positive ethos. All right, we're going to do one more example together, but I'm not going to go through the guiding questions. Now I'm just going to skip right to the value conflict and the value assumption and the explanation. So in this example, the conclusion is libraries should not ban certain books, and people should have easy access to books of their choice at the library. So what is the value conflict for this scenario? Well, I see here that they're talking about how libraries should not ban books, okay? And people should have easy access to books of their choice. So the key word here is I see choice and ban. So the conflict for this scenario, to me, I see is order versus freedom, okay? Usually when something is banned, they're trying to control a situation or control the environment or have some sort of control over something. And so usually control means order. They want to have order. And then choice means freedom to me. So these are the two values that are in conflict with each other. So therefore, what is my value assumption? Again, my value assumption just directly states what my value preference is, or in this case, what is the value preference? And the value assumption states the value preference, which is freedom is more important than order. So I hope this gives you some understanding of how to find value assumptions. Keep in mind a couple of things. You can have different value assumptions. Just remember to make sure you explain yourself. Why did you choose these values? Okay, so in this case here, the explanation is the freedom to choose any books without limitation of books being banned is more important than to control what books people can read. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that the value assumption is just a direct statement of what the value preference is.